Good afternoon, everyone. On this beautiful Sunday afternoon, I'm Dr. Joel Faflak. I'm Professor of English here at the university. I'm also Director of the School for Advanced Studies, and I'm here today in my role as Chair of the McIntosh Gallery Committee. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome all of you here today. I want to take a moment first, however, to acknowledge that our beautiful campus at Western is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Ottawadran peoples, all of whom have long-standing relationships to the land of southwestern Ontario and the City of London. The First Nations communities of our local area include the Chippewa of the First Thames First Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. And in our region, there are 11 First Nations communities, as well as a growing Indigenous urban population. Western values the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all of the original peoples of Turtle Island, also known as North America. We in Arts and Culture, here to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the McIntosh Gallery, and of course Canada 150, two occasions to remind ourselves and celebrate the incredible privilege that we have to be at Western University and in a country like Canada. The arts and culture have always been a kind of battleground, as it were, different from the battleground our distinguished lecturer will be talking about today, but a battleground nonetheless, and a very productive one to celebrate or to think about and critique intolerance as well as tolerance, injustice as well as justice, ugliness as well as beauty, the horrors of war as well as the victories of war. And arts and culture and the amazing legacy of the McIntosh Gallery speaks to that battle, as do our students who battle with their minds and their hearts and their souls on a daily basis. And they are our greatest hope for the future, especially at this moment in time when, unfortunately, it seems we will have a continual battle with injustice and intolerance. But we have a leader with us here at the university who is at the front of helping us fight that battle, and it gives me great honor and it is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Amit Shakma, the president of our university, who will bring greetings from the university. Amit.
Thank you very much, Joel, for your kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to you and to your colleagues at McIntosh to be able to co-host today's special event. On behalf of all of my colleagues at Western, let me welcome you all from the community and beyond for joining us this afternoon to participate as one of many events that will take place over the course of the year on our campus to celebrate our country's 150th birthday. Of course, along with that, we are now celebrating McIntosh Gallery's 75th birthday. Those of you who are here, you're all supporters of McIntosh, so I don't need to say much except to say to you that how pleased I am with James Patton and his team for the wonderful leadership they provide to this wonderful gallery we have. Many of us, we consider McIntosh to be a very special place, a jewel in our crown, if you will. Many universities actually love to have McIntosh, and we have it. We are much richer for it. It not only enriches our academic endeavors at the university, enriches our cultural life, but I believe that be in line with the thinking of many Londoners when I say that it also enriches the cultural life of our city of London. Earlier this afternoon, we are delighted to host a luncheon for a loyal and enthusiastic group of people who have supported our gallery over the years through their philanthropy and volunteer leadership. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all in public for your generous support, because without that, whether in a volunteer capacity or in a philanthropic capacity, we simply would not be able to do what we do through the gallery. And finally, I would like to welcome our distinguished speaker, who will be formally introduced just in a moment. I do want to thank General Chastelain for sharing his time with us today. I had an opportunity to talk to the General briefly. When I was a graduate student, a newcomer to Canada, when I began my Canadian journey in the early 80s, suddenly, I'm a news junkie. I could see the General doing many things for the country, and since then, of course, like many of you, we followed his many contributions beyond his role with the government, in particular his role in Ireland, and I certainly, consider, the General to be a great Canadian, and what a privilege, General, to welcome you to our campus. I'm sorry that it took us that long. I thank McIntosh Gallery for rectifying that mistake, so the General is with us today. Let me add one more element, actually. General de Chastelain is actually quite familiar with the universities, because at one point in time in his career, he was the Chancellor, or something equivalent, Vice Chancellor of the Royal Military College. And we managed to talk about a little bit of academic issues as well. So again, thank you all for being here, and we'll proceed with our speaker with the introduction. Thank you all for coming again.
Thank you, Dr. Shakma. My role as chair of the McIntosh Gallery Committee is purely ceremonial. It must be because I look good in a suit. Yes, I do look good in a suit. The people who really run the show, however, James, Catherine, and her team are really to be commended for the incredible job they do on a daily basis. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Catherine Elliott-Shaw, who's the curator of the McIntosh Gallery and the incredible curator of the Behind the Lines exhibit, which I encourage all of you to see at the McIntosh Gallery if you haven't. I'm calling Catherine up now to introduce our distinguished lecturer for this afternoon.
Thank you, Joel. I have the honor this afternoon to introduce the McIntosh Gallery Distinguished Lecturer for 2017, General John de Chastelain. General de Chastelain was born a British subject in Bucharest, Romania, and educated in England and Scotland. He immigrated to Canada in 1955, where he joined the Canadian Army Militia as a private in the Calgary Highlanders. Subsequently, he attended the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario, graduating in 1960 with a degree in history and a commission in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. His career involved tours as a company commander on NATO duty in Germany and on UN duty in Cyprus. As a colonel, he was the base commander in Montreal during the 2-year period leading up to the 1976 Olympic Games, and the deputy chief of staff of the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus and commander of the Canadian contingent there. As a brigadier general, he was commandant of the Royal Military College of Canada, and I'm told at that time, at the tender age of 39, he could still do the obstacle course with the 4th-year class. Commander of the 4th Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group in Lahr, Germany, and Director General of Land Doctrine and Operations at National Defence Headquarters in Ottawa. As a Major General, he was the Deputy Commander of the Army Field Force and Commander of the FMC Division. As a Lieutenant General, he was Assistant Deputy Minister for Personnel at NDHQ and Vice Chief of the Defence Staff. In September 1989, he was promoted general and appointed Chief of the Defence Staff, a position he held during the end of the Cold War, the First Gulf War, the Balkan Wars, and the events at Oka, Quebec. I think he knows a thing or two about home fronts. In January 1993, he transferred to the reserves and was appointed Canada's 18th ambassador to the United States. In January 1994, he was recalled to the regular force and reappointed the Chief of the Defence Staff for an unprecedented second time, a position he held until his retirement in December of 1995. From November of 95, he took part in the Northern Ireland peace process as one of the international chairmen involved in the talks that led to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of April 1998. In September 1997, he was also appointed to chair the Independent International Commission on Decommissioning, whose mandate involved the decommissioning of paramilitary arms, and this ended only in March of 2011. General de Chastelain is a Companion of the Order of Canada, a Commander of the Order of Military Merit, a Companion of Honour, which is a British order as appointed by Her Majesty the Queen, and he is the only Canadian currently in that order, which is limited to only 65 living members. He's also Commander of the Order of St. John, a Commander of the Legion of Merit, which is an American order, and he has the Medal of Merit and Honor of Greece. He has honorary doctorates from 10 universities and is an honorary fellow of Lady Margaret Hall College in Oxford. And on the eve of the Vimy centennial, we should also note that he is a recipient of the Vimy Medal, the Vimy Award, which recognizes a Canadian who has made a significant and outstanding contribution to the defense and security of our nation and the preservation of our democratic values. What you may not know, the eyebrows just went up. He doesn't know what I'm going to say. What you may not know is that John is a very accomplished piper, having first been introduced to it at the age of 13 in Edinburgh. He applied that knowledge at the beginning of his military career with the regimental pipes and drums of the Calgary Highlanders. Over the years, he has played for many distinguished, if surprised, listeners, including the Soviet and Hungarian general staffs at the Canadian embassies in Moscow and Budapest at the end of the Cold War, for guests at the ambassador's residence in Washington, and even for the Queen when he was chief of the defense staff. When they met on a few subsequent occasions, Her Majesty always remarked on his piping. But one of his more unusual performances has got to be when he has traditionally piped amidships in a 36-foot canoe during its 202-kilometer voyage between Ottawa and Kingston for an annual Royal Military College fundraiser. John and his wife, Marianne, are also avid Scottish country dancers, which is how my husband and I had the great good fortune to meet them many, many years ago. I am delighted that he has accepted our invitation to present this year's distinguished lecture. Would you join me in welcoming General John de Chastelain?
Check to find my glasses. President Chakma, ladies and gentlemen, Catherine, thank you very much indeed for that very kind welcome and invitation. I would like to tell you what an enormous pleasure it is to be here in London. I used to come to London quite frequently when I was in uniform and when there was a military base here, which unfortunately I was forced to close many years later as Chief of Defence Staff, along with about another 24 bases when the Cold War ended and the government wanted a peace dividend. But it being the home station of the Royal Canadian Regiment, one of the very fine regiments in this country, along with my own, which is not the RCR, it is a pleasure to come back, and particularly since this is the first time I have been on the campus of Western, although I've heard much about Western, and particularly the extraordinary value of the Ivey Business School here. I'm going to speak from a prepared text, because this is a fairly long presentation. I don't want to say things I shouldn't say, and I might do that if I just talk extemporaneously, but I will be happy to deal with any questions at the end. So, speaking formally, on the occasion of the McIntosh Gallery's 75th anniversary exhibition, Behind the Lines, Canada's Homefront Art, I am both pleased and honored to be asked to give this lecture, particularly given that the theme relates to the role that war played in the development of Canada as a nation in this, the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. The fact that it coincides with the 150th anniversary of Canada's Act of Confederation, itself an event accelerated by concerns over war in 1867 following Fenian raids from the United States into Upper and Lower Canada, makes the timing for reflections on Canada's military past and speculation about the future particularly relevant. A period of 150 years contains too much history for the scope of one lecture about Canada, and I intend to spend much of this talk dealing with the past 62 years of that history. But it is worth mentioning that the Canada of today developed over the years from conflicts involving First Nations bands, explorers, the colonists, the settlers and the fur traders, and from wars fought between the French and the British and the Americans, and the nascent Canadians and Fenian invaders. Even after Confederation and as a British colony, Canada began to forge its identity through conflict, from engagement in the Boer War at the turn of the century, and later during the First World War, where out of a population of some 7.5 million Canadians, nearly 700,000 served in uniform, and of whom nearly 61,000 were killed and more than 170,000 injured. Throughout the Currie's Canadian Corps, fighting under British command, was largely credited for the victory at Vimy Ridge in 1917, an event that some regard as a pivotal step in Canada's development as a nation. In fact, the subsequent battle at Hill 70, a few months later, which Currie commanded alone, and in which the strategic hill above the town of Lens was captured, was arguably an even more important step in Canada's eventual independence. Currie was thereafter regarded as a national commander by the Allies and the Canadian Corps as a national army. Moreover, so impressed was British Prime Minister Lloyd George by Canada's military achievements that he asked Canadian Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden to stand in for him on occasion at the Versailles peace negotiations, an unusual honour for the leader of what was still a British colony. Even more significant, Canada was a separate signatory of the 1919 Versailles Treaty. The 1931 Statute of Westminster conferred Dominion status, such that Canada declared war against Germany independent of Great Britain 8 years later, and her involvement in that war further cemented Canada's existence as a nation. Canada ended that war with the third largest navy in the world and the fourth largest Allied air force, and with an army that fought engagements in Europe, North Africa, and Asia, and along with the huge Commonwealth Air Training Plan, whereby Canada trained and prepared Allied crews for involvement in the conflict, it provided a contribution to the war effort out of all proportion to its population. So although it was Pierre Trudeau's repatriation of the Constitution in 1982 that finally established Canada's complete independence, it was Canadian sacrifice on the battlefield through numerous wars and conflicts that paved the way for it. Which is why on this 100th anniversary of Vimy Ridge and Hill 70, we should reflect on that sacrifice. And on this 150th anniversary of Canadian Confederation, we might do well to consider what new national developments and what new sacrifices may yet lie ahead. I mentioned that I propose to deal with the past 62 years, and you may wonder, what is the significance of that? It's simply that I immigrated to Canada 62 years ago. And while the observations I make here are entirely personal, they derive from my involvement as a Canadian in numerous military, political, and diplomatic events that have occurred since then. They also include some other aspects of Canadian life I encountered during my early years in this country and afterwards, and I offer these as what I hope is a fair reflection of significant happenings in our national development and our place in the world during the first half-century after the end of the Second World War. To what degree they may forecast future developments, I, like you, can only speculate. The areas I will discuss are Canada and war, including the 40-plus years of the Cold War, Canada's French-Canadian dimension, Canada's First Nations, Canadian relationships with the United States, and Canada's role in the world, past, present, and potentially future. Addressing these subjects, I will be mentioning what I consider to be Canada the good, as well as Canada the not so good. But my conclusion, I will tell you right now, is that Canada is an extraordinary country, and that we Canadians are fortunate to call our own, due largely to the efforts and the sacrifices of those who went before us, both military and civilian, and whom we should never forget. But I must add that there are areas in which I believe we did not get everything right, and some where we could, and perhaps should, possibly do better. A bit about my personal background, and Catherine has already mentioned some of it. I was born in Bucharest, Romania in July 1937. If you want to do the math, I'll be 80 in July. My father was a British oil engineer, and my mother an American whose father was also in the oil business. With that background and with a Huguenot French name, I used to joke that becoming Canadian was serendipitous and saved me from having to answer a number of questions. When war broke out in 1939, my father joined the British Special Forces and spent the next 4 years in espionage and sabotage operations in the Balkans and North Africa, eventually being parachuted into Romania in late 1943 to sound out its leaders on their readiness to turn against their German allies. Captured during the mission, he spent the next 9 months as a prisoner of war until Romania capitulated in 1944. In 1940, before Romania joined the war against the Allies, my mother took my sister and me to England and then by ship from Southampton to New York to live with her parents, while she went to work for Canada's Sir William Stevenson, nicknamed Intrepid, who was Churchill's principal intelligence contact in the United States. Her espionage work with Stevenson wound down after Pearl Harbor, when the embassies of Germany, Japan, Italy, Vichy France, and the other Axis countries were closed in Washington. And in 1943, she was invited to work for the Secret Intelligence Service in London, MI6, which arranged passage for us on a freighter carrying arms from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to Liverpool. After a train ride from New York, my first visit to Canada was brief, as we boarded the freighter the Manchester Shipper at Pier 21 and joined our Royal Canadian Navy convoy in Halifax Harbour. While U-boats were still active in the North Atlantic, our crossing was uneventful, and our mother went to work with MI6 in London, while my sister and I were sent to a girls' boarding school in Yorkshire, in the north of England, to get away from the bombing. Years later, when I was Chief of the Defence Staff, the British Chief of Defence was startled when I told him that his wife and I had gone to the same boarding school during the war. Although he seemed relieved when I told him I'd been 6 years old when I arrived and 9 when I left. When the war ended, I was sent to a boys' prep school in Hastings on England's south coast. The school had been evacuated in 1940 and occupied by Allied troops preparing for D-Day. And when I arrived there, the sports fields were still full of tank traps and anti-glider poles, and the swimming pool was still covered with barbed wire. Other changes were becoming evident even to my young eyes. Many of the boys at the school were sons of civil servants stationed in India, or officers of the Indian Army, and their conversation was filled with reference to ayahs, saris, memsahibs, and chapatis, and to expressions exchanged amongst each other in Hindi. We were all boarders, and these boys would stay with relatives during the holidays and only go home to India during the long summer breaks. But after 1947 and the formation of the independent states of India and Pakistan, Britain's role in the subcontinent was an end, as indeed was its empire. In 1950, I moved to a secondary boarding school in Edinburgh called Ret'd. It was at a time when the war had begun in Korea, communist uprisings were occurring in Southeast Asia, India and Pakistan's independence from Britain had given rise to a vicious war between them over the future of Kashmir, as well as leading to calls for similar independent movements in the British colonies in Africa and its other dependencies like Cyprus. The Soviet Union garrisoned large numbers of troops in the Eastern European countries it had occupied at the end of the war, including Germany, which was split between East and West, with Berlin a divided city, while the British protectorate in Palestine was the scene of uprisings by Israeli paramilitary organizations, including the Irgun, the Haganah, and the Stern Gang, fighting to set up a new Israeli state. Although World War II was over, it seemed as if numerous other wars were about to begin. In a speech in Fulton, Missouri in March 1946, Churchill claimed that an iron curtain had fallen over Eastern Europe and what became known as the Cold War had begun. Because of the world's continuing unrest, Britain retained compulsory national service after the war, and all males of 18 years or more were required to spend 2 years in the armed forces. To that end, joining the Cadet Corps was obligatory in many schools, and I put on uniform for the first time at the age of 13. Most of us planned to seek a place at university prior to leaving school, and then do our national service first so we could go straight to careers after university, and for that reason I applied to a college at Oxford. But just prior to my final year, my father decided to go back into the oil business, and he was offered a position as vice president of a drilling company in Calgary. To that end, my parents gave up the house they rented in London. Although officially they had both left espionage activity after 1945, my father remained in the Territorial Army SAS, and the house just happened to overlook the grounds of the Soviet embassy. They moved with my sister to Canada in 1954. I was faced with the alternative of remaining in the UK on my own, but I chose to follow them after I finished school a year later, in the summer of 1955. Once again, my transatlantic passage was on a freighter, this one the SS Baron Renfrew, sailing out of Scotland, initially in ballast until a cargo was identified somewhere in North America. The cargo turned out to be pulp paper to be loaded in Gaspé, Quebec, and we sailed into the harbor there with me playing bagpipes on the bow, encouraged by the young Geordie crewman. Ashore to board a train to meet my mother in Montreal, I was surprised by the seemingly gloomy atmosphere among the residents there. And this was explained to me as a result of the recent failure of an appeal against the death sentence of a local hunter called Wilbur Coffin. He had been found guilty of killing an American hunter, but there had been questions raised both about his guilt and about the sentence. Some felt that because the victim was American and tourism from that country was important in Quebec, there had been a rush to judgment. Nonetheless, Coffin was hanged a year later in one of the last executions to be held in Canada, the death penalty being abolished de facto 7 years later, some suggest, in part because of the Coffin affair. I was already witnessing changes in the Canadian society that I barely knew. I turn to my first topic, Canada and war. Unsure of what career path I would follow, I applied to the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario. While I had little interest in a military career at the time, I felt some guilt that I left Britain for Canada when most of my school friends were now in uniform. Many of them serving in Kenya fighting the Mau Mau, in Cyprus fighting Ioka, or in Malaya fighting the communists. RMC requires some math and science credits I didn't have, and I enrolled in Mount Royal College to get these, at the same time joining the local militia regiment, the Calgary Highlanders, as a private piper. A year later, at 19 years of age, I was accepted by RMC and joined the regular army as an officer cadet with a requirement to serve for 3 years after graduation to pay for my education and training there. Military service was not compulsory in Canada then, but only 11 years after the end of World War II, many Canadians had wartime experience in uniform, and Canada had only recently finished fighting the war in Korea, now scaled back to a peacekeeping mission. Elsewhere, events contributed to keeping alive the likelihood of a return to war. In November 1956, the Soviet Union's invasion of Hungary led to a wave of refugees coming to Canada. Around the same time, the British, French, and Israeli invasion of Egypt at Suez threatened to split the NATO alliance and cause a war between East and West in the Middle East. By Christmas, I had some hope that we officer cadets might be mobilized, as happened at the college in 1942, allowing me to escape writing the Christmas math and science exams. But Lester Pearson's Nobel Peace Prize intervention produced a UN peacekeeping force in Egypt, which stabilized the situation. And as it turned out, I passed the exams anyway. Early in the Cold War, Canada stationed an air division in Germany and France, and an infantry brigade group, the forerunner of a planned divisional level flyover, in northern Germany as part of the NATO Allied Air Forces Europe and the British Army on the Rhine. Canadian ships were committed to a NATO standing naval force in the North Atlantic. On graduation from RMC in 1960, with, I might add, a commission as a second lieutenant signed by the Minister of National Defense, a retired Major General with a Victoria Cross, 2 Distinguished Service Orders, a Military Cross, and a number of other British and foreign decorations, I hoped to be sent to Germany, but was posted to the 2nd Battalion of my regiment, the PPCLI in Edmonton, which had a parachute role as part of the defense of Canada's north. A year after I arrived at the battalion, the Berlin Wall was built, and the level of confrontation between NATO and the countries of the Warsaw Pact escalated sharply. That event had a particular result for me and for Edmonton, where the Fallout Warning Center for a nuclear attack on Alberta was located at the headquarters of Western Command in Edmonton's Griesbach Barracks. Each province had its own such center to coordinate daily the downwind distance of zones of danger from nuclear fallout over the cities, each depending on the size of the nuclear weapons predicted and the prevailing winds. But Edmonton was assessed to be a nuclear target for potential Russian attack, as the RCAF base at Namao in the city's north had the longest runway in North America, and it was a refueling base for the United States Strategic Air Command. Accordingly, a new Alberta Fallout Warning Center was established at RCAF Station Penhold, close to the mountains and equidistant between Edmonton and Calgary. And I and 2 other subalterns from different regiments were sent there to act as duty officers for a period of a month each. In fact, to my disgust, I was sent there 2 times, which would have been insufferably boring, except that I used the spare time between compiling the routine daily fallout forecasts by studying for and then passing the exams for promotion from lieutenant to captain. This propitious act led a year later to an accelerated promotion to captain and my appointment as aide-de-camp to the Chief of the General Staff, the head of the Army in Ottawa. No sooner had I arrived in Ottawa, but the world was engulfed in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Premier Khrushchev began placing nuclear missiles in Cuba aimed at North America, in retaliation for President Kennedy having placed nuclear missiles in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union. Few in Canada were aware of how close the world came to nuclear war in those tense days during October 1962. At one stage, I was required to tell the CGS I had sent his Batman home to pack a suitcase for him, as he was on 30 minutes' notice to move to the Defen bunker at Carp, where Canada's government would attempt to run the country from underground after a nuclear exchange had begun. When he heard I was not to accompany him, the bunker being only large enough to accommodate key members of government, he seemed embarrassed and asked what I proposed to do. I told him I planned to go home, sit down in the front of the TV with my wife and a bottle of whiskey, and watch what happened. We all know the outcome, of course. Khrushchev blinked, and Kennedy removed the missiles from Turkey. But it was not long, and was not until long after the event that the world learned how close to nuclear war it had in fact become. Russian records show that at the time, 4 conventional Soviet submarines, which NATO classified as being Foxtrot class, were in the ocean approaches to Cuba to provide cover for the Russian ships carrying the missiles. And these had been identified and were being pursued by an American aircraft carrier, anti-submarine destroyers, and aircraft. Among their 10 torpedoes, each Russian submarine carried one with a T-5 5-kiloton nuclear warhead. The Captain Valentin Savitsky, the commander of submarine B-59, out of touch with the other submarines and with Moscow, and unable to surface and replenish oxygen or recharge his batteries, all the while being bombarded with percussion grenades dropped by the American ships to indicate they had pinpointed his location, assumed that war might already have begun, and he prepared to fire his nuclear torpedo at the American aircraft carrier, the USS Randolph. In this decision, he had the concurrence of the political officer aboard, one Ivan Maslenikov. Had it not been that the Chief of Staff of the submarine squadron, Commander Vasily Arkhipov, was aboard B-59 and countermanded the order, it would have been carried out, and the world today might have been a very different place. After 1962, the Cold War continued with periods of high tension, including the Soviet invasion of Cuba in 1968, of Czechoslovakia in 1968, at a time when Canada's brigade group in Germany had nuclear artillery and rocket warheads on their bases under American control, while at home the RCAF similarly had nuclear weapons under American control. After 1968, the armed confrontation in Europe remained in place, but more as a war of words until August 1980, when martial law was declared in Poland in the wake of Lech Wales's attempt to unionize dock workers in Gdansk. The latter event occurring just after I took command of Canada's Mechanized Brigade Group, now in southern Germany as part of the American-led Central Army Group. NATO's DEFCON rating was ratcheted up, and we prepared to move the brigade group to our defensive positions 300 kilometers to the east between the Czech border and Nuremberg, where the General Defense Plan called for us to dig in and meet the second wave of Soviet advance. But the tension subsided as more of the Warsaw Pact countries began to move towards increased autonomy and independence. 9 years later, as I was taking over as Canada's Chief of the Defense Staff, the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War was at an end. Soon within NATO headquarters in Brussels, former adversaries sat around the table as partners for peace, and not long after, many would sit as NATO members themselves. In the NATO Chiefs of Defense Military Committee, where I usually sat between Belgium and Denmark, I now sat between Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia. As part of Glasnost, I was invited to visit the former Warsaw Pact countries, and I invited their Chiefs of Defense to visit Canada in return. In 1990, I went to what was still called the Soviet Union and met with their Chief of Defense, General Moiseev. Asked where I would like to visit, other than Moscow, I suggested Murmansk, and when asked why a soldier would want to visit what was essentially a naval area, I replied that Canada was tasked to send a brigade group to northern Norway in the event Russia invaded there, and I wanted to see what they had in the region. They said fine, and I visited the Motor Rifle Division in the Polyarny area, and then the Russian Northern Fleet at Severomorsk, where the urbane and extremely agreeable commander of the Soviet Northern Fleet, Admiral Gromov, was an obliging host, taking me aboard a battle cruiser and then a Victor III Hunter killer submarine, and answering all the questions I put to him. As a trivia aside, I would add that the Soviet submariner's uniform I wore while I was on the Victor III, with de Chastelain written in the Cyrillic alphabet, is now in the Canadian War Museum. During the flight to Murmansk, my accompanying officer was a Colonel General Omelichev, an infantry officer like me, and amongst other things, a fan of the Montreal Canadiens. And we discovered during conversation through interpreters that in early 1965, when I was commanding a mechanized infantry company in the Canadian Brigade Group in the northern part of West Germany, he was commanding a mechanized infantry company in a Soviet tank division in the northern part of East Germany. We both agreed it was a good thing we were meeting now and for the first time. Omelichev and his wife accompanied my wife and me during the next visit to the headquarters of Leningrad Military District. But my stay there was shortened when I received a call from the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff in Ottawa to say I was required to return to Canada immediately to deal with the situation involving First Nations Mohawks that had been ongoing for some weeks over a dispute concerning Oka, Quebec. At my request, Omelichev arranged for my aircraft to arrive at the Leningrad Military Airport, and while we waited there, he said he was being very discreet and not asking me what emergency required my early return to Canada. But he added that if it had something to do with the imminent war in the Gulf, following Iraq's recent invasion of Kuwait, he would certainly understand, although Russia had no intention whatsoever of getting involved in it. I told him I thought there was no way the Canadian government would want to get involved in the Gulf War either, and that my return was simply to deal with a local situation. In Ottawa, I was met by the Vice Chief, who said the staff was ready to give me a briefing on Oka, but he added that we just received a request from the Prime Minister to give him military options for Canada's possible armed invention in the Gulf. In the event, we did provide a sea, air, land task force to take part in the 1990 Gulf War, fortunately without deaths or serious casualties. A year later, General Moiseev visited Canada with a Russian delegation in a highly successful visit that took him to military establishments from Ontario to British Columbia. One important element of that visit was that the Canadian government authorized me to sign a treaty with Russia on Canada's behalf to prevent dangerous incidents in the air. As to my newly established connection with the armed forces of a country I had spent all my adult life training to fight, when I was recalled a second time to serve as Chief of Defense Staff, I received a letter from the then Russian Chief of General Staff, General Kolesnikov, in which he said, and I quote, "On behalf of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and myself, I congratulate you on the appointment to the position of Chief of Defense. I express hope that relationships between Russia and Canadian Armed Forces will continue to develop on the basis of goodwill and trust in the future. I use this opportunity to wish you, General, good health, prosperity, and every success in your responsible activities." I might ad-lib here for something that Catherine mentioned about my playing the bagpipes in Budapest and in Moscow. At the time, I was president of the Dominion Canada Rifle Association, which, unlike its American counterpart, has nothing to do with the right to bear arms and everything to do with target shooting. And annually, I would go to the International Rifle Championships in Bisley, England, with the team, and I would take my bagpipes and pipe the winners into the tent at the end. And that event immediately preceded first my visit to Budapest, and immediately after that my visit to Bucharest. So I had my bagpipes when I arrived in Budapest. And the Hungarians put on an entertainment display as well as all the military stuff that they had to do, and they gave a dinner party for us with dancers and singers and the like. And the Canadian ambassador said he wanted to reciprocate. He had a member of his staff who was a concert violinist. His wife played the piano, and he heard I had my bagpipes with me, and would I play? And I said, yes, not with the piano and the violin, but yeah. And I did that much to the surprise of General Borshitz and the Hungarian General Staff. A few days later, I was in Moscow, and the same thing happened again. The Russians entertained us, music, dancing, and the acting ambassador, because the ambassador was back in Canada, said, I understood you played the bagpipes in Budapest. I'm giving a cocktail party for the Russian General Staff. Would you play the bagpipes there? So I did that, much to the surprise of General Moiseyev and the other Russians, who I don't really think knew what I was doing. But anyway, they applauded. 2 weeks later, I was in Brussels for a meeting of the NATO Military Committee dealing with the Gulf War. And my American counterpart, Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, got a hold of me. He said, hey, John, I understand you were in Budapest and Moscow. How'd that go? I said, it went fine, Colin. I played the bagpipes and the Warsaw Pact collapsed. And he looked at me and said, well, don't you play those things around us here in NATO? Today, the Cold War has been over for 28 years, but in that time, Canada has been involved in wars in the Gulf, the Balkans, Somalia, Kosovo, Rwanda, Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and now has troops training in areas where Russian adventurism may be expanding its reach. Later this spring, Canada will provide 450 troops to join a NATO training force under Canadian command in Latvia, as other NATO members send troops to the other Baltic states to deter aggression there. A renewed Cold War between East and West is not impossible if Russian expansion into its former regions, some of them now NATO members, does continue. And for that reason, a strong and united NATO is probably the best countermeasure. In that light, the American president's recent call for NATO members to honor their financial commitments, Canada being prominent among those who consistently fail to do so, is both understandable and necessary. Yet the government's 1917 budget, announced in Ottawa 2 weeks ago, strips $8.4 billion out of the equipment budget of national defense, promising to put it back and spend it sometime over the next 20 years. A decision which an analyst with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute asserts will almost certainly drive Canada's defense spending below 1% of GDP, less than half of what is expected from NATO members and what Canada is committed to providing. Now, I would say that being an ex-soldier, wouldn't I? And I have to qualify that by saying that in 2014, the 28 members of, 28 military members of NATO agreed to move towards 2% of GDP in their defense spending over the period of the next 10 years. And we're only 3 years into that, so watch this space. Also of concern in the event East-West confrontation escalates is that the stability that mutually assured destruction provided in keeping the Cold War from ever becoming hot may no longer exist in this era of worldwide terrorist activity involving suicidal extremists and increases in the number of nations with nuclear arms, at least one of them, North Korea, with unpredictable intentions about using them. Canada has long been an arbiter for peace in the world, but in the 150 years of its existence, it has not been reluctant to engage with others in using military force when necessary to ensure that peace prevails. We should stand ready, properly manned, equipped, and willing to do so in the future. I now turn to my second topic, the French dimension in Canada. Given my Hugo ancestry and French name, I'm frequently taken for French till I open my mouth, when my British and American heritage becomes clear. When I first arrived here, knowing that what is now Canada was French before the English came, I felt a mild sense of destiny, while understanding little of the history that followed Wolfe's victory on the plains of Abraham in 1760, beyond the fact that there are 2 official languages and the majority of Canadians of French descent live in Quebec, while substantial French-speaking communities exist in New Brunswick, Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta. Early in my first year at RMC, I heard a couple of classmates conversing together in fluent French, and I remarked on this to one of my English-speaking colleagues. His reply was, "So what? They're French Canadians." And I replied, "But everything here is done in English. We're having a tough enough time as it is. It must be even more difficult for them." He shrugged and he said, "Well, that's the way it is here." I thought to myself then that that was wrong, and looking back on it, I was right. 21 years later, I was a brigadier general and commandant of the college. And by then, if an officer cadet was to graduate and receive a degree and an officer's commission, he, and later she, had to be functionally bilingual in both official languages, as well as passing the academic, military, and physical fitness qualifications. That same situation prevails today, as I believe it should. One of the reasons for the move towards official bilingualism was la Révolution Tranquille, or the so-called Quebec Quiet Revolution. In Quebec, the heretofore largely parochial and church-oriented nature of society, which left commercial and financial decisions predominantly to English-speaking corporations in both Montreal and outside the province, gradually developed into a robust French-speaking business culture with decisions made by French speakers, and where pride in the different nature of the French-Canadian society increasingly came to the fore, not only in Quebec, but also in other parts of Canada where the French language was prevalent. I recall my early years in Ottawa in the 1960s, when impatient Quebec nationalists formed a protest group called the Front de Libération du Québec, or FLQ, in 1963, and began a series of bombings of military and government targets as a move to push the Quebec government towards independence. Their act of violence gained them little or no sympathy in Quebec or elsewhere, and it received outright condemnation from both English and French-speaking Canadians when it led to the death of an overnight guard at a Canadian Forces recruiting centre in Montreal. This sentiment of extreme nationalism reached its nadir in 1970 with the kidnapping of the British Trade Commissioner James Cross and the subsequent murder of the Quebec Minister Pierre Laporte by members of the FLQ. I was commanding an infantry battalion in Winnipeg at the time and took half of it to Montreal to join other troops called out by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau to deal with the crisis. After Laporte's murder, Trudeau implemented the Extreme War Measures Act that imposed strict conditions on society in the hunt for the perpetrators, including arrest without charge of anyone believed to have a connection with them. The guilty FLQ members were subsequently apprehended and expelled from the country, and the War Measures Act was replaced by different legislation, which was to have a particular result for me 20 years later. Only a couple of years after the 1970 October crisis, I attended a year-long bicultural and bilingual program at Laval University, and then spent 3 years in Quebec, including one as staff officer with Quebec militia units located from Trois-Rivières to the Gaspé, and then 2 years commanding the military base in Montreal, leading up to the 1976 Games there. It gave me a close-up opportunity to observe, understand, and appreciate the nature of French-Canadian history, its vibrant contemporary society, and its rich military heritage, and to realize what an important part all of them have played and continue to play in the makeup of Canada as a whole. In 1994, when Prime Minister Chrétien recalled me as ambassador from Washington, he asked if I would return for a second term as Chief of the Defense Staff. I demurred, pointing out that it would be an unprecedented step and that there were very capable serving generals and admirals available to fill the post and in whom he could have full confidence. He then expressed his concern about an upcoming referendum on Quebec's future in Canada, to be held the following year, adding that he was worried about the difficulty it might present to Francophone members of the Canadian forces. He noted that although I was an Anglophone, I spoke French, I had recent experience of Quebec and of its military culture, and he felt I could be helpful to him in managing the run-up to the referendum as it affected members of the armed forces, as well as afterwards, in whatever result might follow. Accordingly, I agreed to complete the remaining 2 years of my predecessor's tenure. As it turned out, during the months leading to the 1995 referendum, I was obliged to address concerns expressed by members of Francophone units and formations to their commanders in Quebec and across Canada about their future in the event the referendum called for Quebec's independence. I responded by sending a message forces-wide stating that our only role in the event of Quebec's secession from Confederation would be to assist the powers of law and order to ensure that the change would be conducted peacefully. Some English and French publications interpreted that to mean I was saying that the forces would not fight to preserve Canada as a nation, while others pointed out that that was precisely what I was not saying. In the event, by a very narrow margin, as you know, the decision was taken that Quebec would remain part of Canada, a decision I wholeheartedly endorse and one that I hope is never put to the test again. Canada is a great nation because of all its constituent parts, including Quebec, and of all its citizens, no matter what their linguistic, religious, or original national heritage is. In dealing with the subject of heritage, I turn my attention to my next subject, the role of the First Nations in Canada. When I came to this country, I had little knowledge of First Nations history or accomplishments, other than that they were the early settlers who, over the years, made alliances with both French and British newcomers, fighting on the side of each in the wars between them, as well as in the wars to repel Fenian and American invasions. I was aware of the unique nature of native art, of their ability to survive in the harsh environments of Canada's north, and of the respect for nature and wildlife that it was fundamental to their culture. As a soldier, I was also aware of the many First Nation soldiers decorated for valor in foreign wars by Canada, including those in my own regiment. But it was also in my early years as a military officer that I was required from time to time to visit Canadian penitentiaries in readiness for a possible military requirement to respond in support of police and prisoner officers if needed, and where I was disturbed to see the percentage of inmates who were of First Nations origin. Like many Canadians, I was further disturbed by the news of conditions on some of Canada's reserves, of the residential school system that took young First Nations children from their families to be educated far away, a program that was still in effect when I came to Canada, and of the shocking history of the many First Nations women assaulted, killed, or disappeared over the past number of years. Like other Canadians, I'm aware of the steps governments at the federal and provincial levels have taken and are taking to address these issues, some of which will be of long duration and some which hopefully will be more speedily resolved. But there are issues that need to be dealt with fully and fairly if we're to claim over the next 50 years that Canada really is the true North, strong and free, that we sing about. Which brings me to address the unfortunate situation which put me and Canada's armed forces in opposition to some of Canada's First Nations members during the situation I mentioned earlier, which occurred at Oka, Quebec in 1990. The older ones among you will remember the circumstances of that situation nearly 27 years ago, when Mohawks, principally from Quebec reserves, set up blockades around Montreal in protest over the plans of the mayor of Oka to extend a golf course onto what they claimed were ancient Mohawk burial grounds. Quebec police and armed Mohawks remained in a standoff for weeks at the barricades, at which a policeman was killed in circumstances never resolved, until eventually the armed forces were called to intervene. The War Measures Act, which Pierre Trudeau had implemented during the FLQ incident in 1970, had since been replaced by a section of the National Defence Act, whereby premiers of provinces can call directly on the Chief of Defence, not the Minister of Defence, not the Prime Minister, the Chief of Defence, to provide troops or resources in aid of the civil power to assist the province's police in the resolution of dangerous incidents that are beyond their resources or capacity to handle. Accordingly, when I returned from Leningrad, Premier Bourassa called on me to provide troops in aid of the civil power, to replace the Sûreté de Quebec at the barricades, and then to remove the barricades, a requirement which put soldiers squarely in confrontation with armed members of the Mohawk community. To do that, I tasked the Army Commander, Lieutenant General Kent Foster, an RMC classmate, to provide the necessary troops, and he committed the 5e Groupe Brigade Mécanisée du Canada from Valcartier, Quebec, to the role. At the same time as this was happening, I was responding to the Premier's request. I was also deploying our military task force to the Middle East to join the coalition against Iraq and to implement the escalating UN resolutions that would eventually see the coalition drive Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait. But while deploying the Canadian task force to Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, I was much more concerned with the Oka situation. Having to order armed Canadian soldiers to confront armed Canadian civilians at home has the potential for a nightmare ending that nobody, and particularly no soldier here, ever wants to see. In the event, and thanks to the profession of the soldiers, and particularly the leadership shown by Mohawk clan mothers and spiritual leaders, the confrontation ended with no further deaths, although some injuries were caused and some ill will generated both among the Mohawks and the citizens who were inconvenienced by the standoff. For me, a postscript of sorts to the Oka event occurred a number of years later during my involvement in the Northern Ireland peace process. when I was invited to give a lecture on that process to graduate students at the University of Galway. During the question period that followed, a student rose and he said, "General, I have a piece of paper here which states," and I quote, "General de Chastelain is a white racist supremacist," unquote. Would you care to comment? I replied, "Well, I'm white, but I can't comment on the rest of the statement because I don't know what the context is." I found out later it was a note posted on the internet which blamed me for the armed forces' involvement in Oka, as well as for providing armored personnel carriers to the RCMP in 1995 to deal with a violent disturbance over unceded indigenous territories at Gustav's Lake in British Columbia. I have a saying in the Army, if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined. I turn now to my fourth topic, Canada-USA relations. In the interest of full disclosure, I should start by saying I'm a great admirer of the United States, of its leader and its people. I believe that as a nation it has provided leadership to the world over many years during trying and dangerous circumstances, and that it has demonstrated skill and generosity in dealing with a host of world issues that might otherwise have gone tragically unaddressed. Its armed forces are the best equipped and among the best trained in the world, and they're led by some of the finest officers I have met and worked with. In my brief time as ambassador, I met with American politicians and statesmen who are not only masters of their mandates, but polite, interested in the views of others, and willing to consider options other than their own preferences. My personal feelings aside, it goes without saying that good relations between our two countries are vital to the future of Canada, and that they're important to the USA too. Geography and the difference in population size make that necessary, and a shared European-based heritage and belief in the same social philosophies make it both desirable and possible. There have been occasions in the past when political leaders on both sides have not liked each other, but relations have continued workably in spite of that. The relationship works best when both leaders respect and appreciate the other, and in recent years that has been largely the case. But personalities should never stand in the way of the two countries living equably together, and there are a number of formal agreements in place to ensure that is so. In issues of defense, the Permanent Joint Board on Defense and agreements like NATO and NORAD define and guide our mutual military obligations, and regular meetings between Canada's Armed Forces Council and the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff provide a personal dimension to help it work. Elsewhere, the International Joint Commission oversees the management of the Great Lakes shared by the two countries, a vital mechanism in an age when drought is a likely result of global warming. And on matters of trade, the proper functioning of the North American Free Trade Agreement is overseen by powerful trade negotiations working on both sides. Trade is vital for Canada's well-being, with some $600 billion in two-way trade annually between the two countries. While a much higher percentage of our trade is with the USA, a number of American states rely on trade with Canada for their financial well-being. One reason, perhaps, that the Trump administration's recently announced protectionist trade initiatives seem so far to be stepping carefully around Canada's place in NAFTA. NAFTA was in the final stage of being negotiated during the year I was ambassador in Washington, and even before it was approved, President Clinton made clear his intention to make the existing free trade agreement between the two countries work, and to ensuring good relations with Canada were maintained. In responding to my accreditation as ambassador early in 1993, he stated in part, and I would tell you I took over as ambassador before he took over as president, so I was experienced. He said, "Mr. Ambassador, the relationship between the United States and Canada continues to be excellent. Our ties are profound and deep. They are based upon the common values and ideals that have allowed our peoples to become the friendliest of neighbors. Canada has long stood our partner in promoting democracy and human rights throughout the world, both of which will be priorities of my administration. The many crises confronting us, including those in the Balkans and Somalia, where Canada has peacekeeping troops, will require our joint efforts. Canada and the United States will work together in the Group of Seven, the United Nations, NATO, CSCE, and the OAS to address many of these mutual concerns. The ability to address these concerns presupposes prosperity at home. Our economies are emerging from recession, and I'm delighted to see that our free trade agreement has increased trading activity between our two nations. The United States is blessed to have a neighbor like Canada. Together we can face the challenges ahead. I wish the Prime Minister and the Canadian people well." Unquote. That statement preceded the implementation of NAFTA by a matter of months, but the same sentiment of cooperation was evident at the end of the Obama administration, when in a speech last December at a dinner given for him in Ottawa by Prime Minister Trudeau, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden said, in part, "I'm absolutely confident that we in North America are better positioned than any time since the end of World War II to lead the world, to lead the hemisphere, to move it to a place in a way that we haven't seen. We're going to get through this period because we're Americans and we're Canadians. And so I toast you by saying, Vive la Canada, because we need you very, very badly." During the 24 years of NAFTA's existence, its dispute regulating mechanisms have enabled trade relations to work well for Canada, and it is to be hoped that the same situation will continue. But America's past objections to Canada's alleged advantage in areas like softwood lumber and wheat, and there and others often raise concerns about Canada's supply-managed tariffs on dairy and poultry products, appear likely to encounter more serious scrutiny now by President Trump's negotiators. And while Prime Minister Trudeau's recent meeting with President Trump was largely positive, it is to be hoped that any concessions made to us will not be to the detriment of our NAFTA partner, Mexico. It is to be hoped also that Canada's admirable preoccupation with free international trade will also rub off at home and eliminate some of the trade barriers we currently have between our own provinces. Certainly in the first few weeks of the Trump administration, it has called into question some of the USA's practices and past agreements on issues like trade, immigration, defense, and border security. It remains to be seen what effect these potential changes will have for the relationship between our two countries. Our Prime Minister is addressing the situation with care, and we wish him well with it. The implications for both our countries in getting it right during these difficult world times remains of enormous importance. I turn now to Canada's role in the world, past, present, and future. As to Canada's past, I've already referred to its developments through years of both war and peace, and the reputation it has gained in the world as a sophisticated, democratic nation with a constitution that specifically addresses the rights of the individual in a free and democratic society. By geography, the second largest country in the world and bordering on 3 oceans, it is known for its vast and varied landscape and wildlife and its abundant mineral and food resources. During World War II, Britain and Russia were kept fed, equipped, and capable of fighting, in no small part due to the food, arms, and material shipped from Canada via the merchant navy's dangerous North Atlantic runs to Liverpool and Murmansk. Canada developed from a predominantly rural population to a predominantly urban one years after the USA, largely because it saw itself, and was seen by others, as a plentiful producer of food and natural resources. Canada has long been considered a cornucopia of vast and valuable riches. Even during the last World War, in the hellish environments of the extermination camp at Auschwitz, the warehouse where the belongings and valuables stolen from incoming prisoners were stockpiled was called Canada, because it was deemed to be such a source of plenty. But beyond the production of food and resources, Canada has demonstrated its technical excellence through the achievements of its Nobel laureates, as well as the superior and innovative role it has played in the occupation and exploration of space. It has carved a niche for itself in addressing issues of international importance through initiatives like the 1997 Ottawa Treaty to ban landmines, and the establishment of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty in 2000, which established the UN-adopted policy of responsibility to protect, a direct outcome of the 1990 massacres at Srebrenica and Rwanda. Until the outbreak of civil and ethnic war in the Balkans in the early 1990s, Canada was known for its involvement in peacekeeping operations. And in the years since, now that peacekeeping has morphed into peacemaking and peace enforcement, entirely different concept that involved armed intervention, Canada has continued to be active. Although as recently as last week, the Prime Minister has rejected saying exactly when Canadians will take on new UN peacekeeping roles. Equally prominent has been Canada's involvement in assisting in various attempts to resolve conflicts in various countries around the world through the participation of its politicians, diplomats, academics, physicians, soldiers, policemen, and others. While the application of the term honest broker to Canadians involved in international disputes has perhaps become a cliché, it is nonetheless regarded as apt by many. As to the present, a number of unfolding events will confront Canada with serious challenges to its prosperity as home, as well as to its responsibility as one of the rich nations of the world. Some of these events I've referred to in passing. Others include the famine that has reached epidemic proportion in recent days in Nigeria, South Sudan, Yemen, and Somalia, where tens of thousands are likely to die of malnutrition in the coming months unless sufficient food aid is provided and a state of security for its safe delivery is established. As well, the rising incidence of diseases resistant to medicines, the new and dangerous insect-borne infections, and the problems of mass migration from countries in Africa and the Middle East threaten to exhaust the resources of food and medicine in the overcrowded refugee camps in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. Only a world community effort seems likely to be able to address these concerns. One obvious way that Canada can help is in the provision of foreign aid and in the willingness to increase the number of refugees it is prepared to take in. But Canada at the moment is one of the least generous countries offering foreign aid to the world. A recent article in the publication Open Canada, titled "On Paying Its Global Share, Canada is Not Back, It's Far Back," refers to the speech made by the Prime Minister at the United Nations last September when he stated, and I quote, "We're Canadian and we're here to help." But the article chronicles where Canada is falling short in the proportion of its national income committed to collective security and international assistance. It states that Canada is last among its global peers in this area, providing only 0.2% of gross national income, and that with Japan it is the only country in its peer group failing to reach even halfway to international benchmarks for either collective security or international assistance. The article concludes, and I quote, "If the Trudeau government remains on its present course, it will have the lowest commitment to international assistance of any Canadian government in the last half-century," unquote. So it would seem that this is one area that Canada can do more to help address present international problems, and another is in the area of taking in refugees. Canada has agreed to take in 25,000 refugees from the war in Syria, a respectable number perhaps for a country of 35 million. But other countries with smaller population have taken in more. Canada has a well-deserved reputation for taking in refugees from war, except during the dark days of World War II when, like the USA, we turned away Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution in Germany. I believe we should build on the good reputation we established with Hungarian refugees in 1956 and Vietnamese refugees in 1975, who have added positively, as have others, to both our society and our wealth. Compassion for their situation is one reason, and our own self-interest is another. With a low birth rate and an aging population, Canada needs immigrants to continue our development as a prosperous and leading nation in the world. You might say that being an immigrant, I would say that, and yes, I would, and I have, but I believe it to be true. As to the future, I think the many challenges that will involve us include, in no special order, the effect that the new administration in the United States will have on its policies domestically and internationally, and in particular on trade, defense, and foreign relations. Second, the nature of the increasing Russian international adventurism, its expansion into the Ukraine and the Mediterranean, and its potential threat to countries of the former Soviet Union, and in particular to the Baltic states. Third, the pressure on the structure of NATO following the ongoing dispute between Turkey and other countries of the alliance, in particular the Netherlands and Germany. Fourth, the threat that increasingly sophisticated developments in information technology may have on both domestic and international behavior, as well as its use in interfering in the affairs of others. And finally, the problems posed by the continuing issues of global warming, overpopulation, migration, famine, disease, and resource diminution. How Canada addresses each of these challenges and how we are able to join with others in finding positive solutions to them will shape how this country will look 50 years from now when it celebrates its double centenary. Many of us here will not be around to see that, of course, but based on how it has reacted to world challenges in the past, I would be optimistic that Canada will be playing an even more prominent role in the world 50 years from now. How to conclude this examination of Canada's post-World War II history, post-World War II, in this year of the country's 150th anniversary and 100th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Much has been achieved since nuclear bombs were used to end the last World War, in spite of the uncertainty of a potential nuclear Armageddon that threatened the world during the troubled years of the Cold War. And yet, as conflicts once again begin to put armed nations more and more at odds with each other, we might wonder what needs to be done to prevent a return to the dark days of the last half of the past century. It must surely be for countries like ours to work in concert with allies and like-minded nations to attempt to understand the differences and difficulties that divide us and to establish what measures we can to resolve them without abandoning our principles of freedom, firmness, justice, and equality. In preparing this talk, I came by chance on an editorial I wrote at the age of 20, when you know everything, in the RMC College newsletter when I was in the middle of my second year there and my first 2 years in Canada. It was just before Christmas in 1957, almost 60 years ago, the same period I've been talking about today. I wrote in part, and I quote, "Throughout the past centuries, many things in this world have become greatly changed, but the spirit of Christmas has remained the same. This year, however, there is a change. As we gather at home to share in the goodwill and seasonal celebrations, 2 satellites circle the Earth far above our heads in the cold darkness of space, a significant and ominous reminder that our future Christmases may never be quite the same. This is not alarmism or pessimistic conjecture. 12 years ago, after the end of the Second World War, the Allied nations were on top of the world, ahead in industry and scientific research and in the development of atomic power. We felt we had nothing to fear from our defeated enemies or our antagonistic Soviet allies. Yet in the space of a few years, Russia has outstripped the whole world in scientific development and has already begun to leave us far behind. For this, we have only ourselves to blame. The past few years of peace and prosperity have lulled us into a sense of false security, and we have become complacent with a feeling of invulnerability. What is needed is a much more coordinated advance in the field of missile development, and this can only be achieved if our Western nations work in complete confidence with one another, and avoid all the petty disagreements which have so far hindered progress. Where do we ourselves come in? Simply by helping to promote international harmony and by strengthening the bonds of friendship between our country and the other countries of the free world. The time has come when unnecessary rivalry between the Western nations could be disastrous." Unquote. Setting aside the somewhat adolescent philosophy and the ingenuous level of certainty that seemed to permeate this article, as well as the suggestion that developing better missiles might solve anything other than perpetuating an arms race, it's interesting to reflect that it was only 60 years ago that satellites first flew in space, and how far we've come since then in developing them further, and in designing new and more deadly armaments, and in finding other scientific ways to destroy each other many times over. And how far we have not come in working together to make the use of such things unnecessary as we face the other potentially deadly global threats I've already referred to. My final thought is the oft-repeated adage that if we ignore the mistakes of history, we are doomed to repeat them. And if we forget the sacrifice of those who gave our lives for the way of life we enjoy today, we break faith with them and with what they died for. In this light, the 2 anniversaries we celebrate this year are especially significant. I'll finish with a final anecdote. A few years ago, when I was in the middle of my involvement in the Northern Ireland peace process, I left my Dublin office to get a haircut at a nearby high-end department store called Brown Thomas, which is one owned by the Canadian Gale and Weston family. There, a young woman in her early 20s cut my hair, and we started talking. After a while, she commented that my accent was Irish, and I replied, "No, I'm a Canadian." And I added, "Your accent isn't Irish either." She replied, "No, I'm from Yorkshire. Do you know where that is?" I said, yes, I know where Yorkshire is. I lived there during the war to get away from the bombing. She said, what war was that? Lest we forget. Thank you for listening.
I'll say, first of all, I've seldom heard such a lengthy round of applause, and I think that bears witness to what a wonderful guest we have here today. Now, John has very kindly said he will take questions, and we have people ready with microphones at the side in our aisles. If you'd like to indicate that you have a question for John, please do so, and we'll get a microphone to you. Do we have questions from the floor?
I would just say that if you do use the mics. 40 years of gunfire and 65 years of playing the bagpipes mean I don't hear so well.
Thank you for that very illuminating talk. You referred a couple of times to Russian adventurism. The other adventurous country that we've seen in the last few years is China, with its efforts in the South China Sea that seem to violate international agreements. Do you think that something like a NATO, an analog, is necessary, which would involve Western countries to deal with that kind of adventurism?
I think it probably would be ideal, but you may recall that there was a Southeast Asia Treaty Organization that was formed years ago and didn't fly. China regards the South China Sea as its area of interest and doesn't accept that others should be concerned about it, which of course a number of countries are, particularly those who are threatened by Chinese extending limits of use of the seas. Australia, of course, is concerned, so are the other democratic countries in the area. I think it's unlikely that it's going to be able to put together an organization to do just that. In fact, I think China would regard it as a provocation. China, after all, is reaching out to countries in the West and in its own neighborhood for trade relations and the like. And I think it will be hard. I personally was concerned to see that the new Chinese ambassador said that the issue of human rights should not enter into any further discussions on trade. I personally would regard that as unacceptable as a condition, and I hope that we don't bow to it. But I don't see a likelihood of a veto in the near future. NATO has grown hugely. When I left NATO and when I left the armed forces in the end of 1995, it had 16 members in the military group. Now it has 28, and many of them, of course, are those countries that fear adventurism by the Soviet Union, not just the Baltic states. Ukraine, of course, is not a member of NATO, not a member of the European community. But there are others like Poland and I think probably to some degree like Hungary and the Czech Republic that also have the same kind of concerns. But no, I think it's unlikely that we will put together an organization to counter Chinese influence in that area. But you heard how wrong I've been in the past in predicting things. I would tell you that from Ireland in 2003, when asked by the CBC, did I think we should get involved in Gulf War II? I said yes. If there are weapons of mass destruction, we should be there. Prime Minister Chrétien, quite rightly, said no, even under pressure from the American president, and Chrétien was right and I was wrong. There were no weapons of mass destruction. But, hey, I've made more mistakes than I care to admit to, and I can't really tell you what's going to happen in China. I don't think we'll have a Southeast Asia Treaty Organization.
We'll go.
Have you considered the possibility of a situation where a preemptive strike against North Korea would be justified and the chance of that actually happening?
I have. I think it is unlikely. I think that the best chance of getting South Korea to mortify what it's doing is to have the Chinese make them do it. Whether they will do that or not, I don't know. But as China looks to become a more accepted major nation in the world, with all of the other responsibilities that go along with that, I think pressure will mount for that to happen. The worrisome thing, of course, would be if Japan does develop nuclear weapons, as they indicate might be possible, or if an attack were made on South Korea by North Korea with missiles. I think the West, particularly the United States, would intervene immediately. I think the current president of the United States would like to guarantee that. But I don't think that an attack on North Korea, unless they do actually something that is an attack on other countries, a deliberate attack on other countries, is likely to take place. I think the West will probably encourage China to do what's necessary.
Hello, I have a question. One of the interesting things that happens in the 62 years that you're covering in your talk is the invention of the internet. And there's a wonderful television show right now called The Americans that's tracing the history of the internet and its relationship to espionage. And one of the places that we're seeing where Cold War is hot is on cybersecurity and cyber warfare. And I was just thinking in your talk that actually, I think it was in Canada where the espionage uncovered the original plot and of stealing of information on nuclear technology. And I'm wondering right now, just given the context of what's happening with the United States in terms of espionage, in terms of cybersecurity, cyber warfare, do you think Canada is prepared for what's taking place? Is espionage taking on a role? Is Canada prepared to deal with these sorts of situations? Are we prepared to deal with appropriate cybersecurity given the context of what's happening in the United States?
I've got to tell you, I'm not an expert on computers. I would also tell you that in 1993, when I was giving a talk, I think at Harvard, when I was ambassador, the question was raised, Mr. Ambassador, what do you think the future is going to be like with the superhighway? And I said, superhighway from where to where? And they said, well, let's forget that. I think Canada is very much aware of what is going on, and CSCE, the Canadian Security and Communications Establishment, is as on top of it as it can be. I think the much greater concern is an organization like WikiLeaks and others who will gain access to information and use it to embarrass either individuals or countries. I'm not technical enough to be able to tell you how that can be countered, but I do know, when I was listening to, on the television, I think it was yesterday, the former Deputy Minister of National Defense, former security advisor to the Prime Minister, talking about the effort it's going to take to make sure that we are secure in that regard. Because not only is it good for us, it is good for the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, the group that are tied into our intelligence network. And if they felt there was a weakness here in Canada that was being exploited, we would cease to get information from them. And that hasn't happened, so I think there is still a confidence that we have it right. How long that will go, I think, depends on what kind of effort we keep putting into it. And I understand we're going to be putting a lot of effort into it, or are already putting a lot of effort into it.
Some comment, General, on your success in Northern Ireland with the decommissioning. And are you at all concerned with the power sharing seemingly at a standstill presently, if I understand the situation?
I would tell you I could talk about Northern Ireland for a couple of hours, but I think that would go beyond my mandate here. Decommissioning was only one aspect of the Belfast Agreement. Very briefly, the Belfast Agreement was about three major issues and then a whole bunch of other issues. The first issue was giving back to Northern Ireland its assembly or provincial government. Northern Ireland is a province that had devolved powers from Westminster and governed itself with a Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And that was eliminated or suspended after 1972 in the Bloody Sunday incident when the parachute regiment killed 14 civilians at Londonderry. And one of the aims of the talks that came after the ceasefires of 1994 to allow talks to take place was, one of them was to come up with a system that would allow an assembly to be put back that was inclusive. The assembly beforehand was 90% unionist, nationalists, for nationalists read largely Catholic, and those who, would like a Northern United Ireland, but really were interested in human rights, their rights, and of course Republicans, Sinn Féin, who were looking for a united Ireland. That was one aspect of the Belfast Agreement, that you should put in place this inclusive government that made sure that Catholics and Protestants, Unionists, Nationalists, Republicans, Loyalists should all have the right to represent their people, so that you ended up with a situation that really wasn't democratic. The First Minister would be the leader of the largest party. The Deputy First Minister would be the leader of the largest party of the other tradition. In other words, if the largest party was Protestant, the leader of the Catholic Party, except they didn't use those words, would be the Deputy First Minister. The first three cabinet ministers would go to the largest party. Next three cabinet ministers would go to the largest party of the other tradition, and the next two, and the next two. So you ended up with enforcing inclusiveness, but without a government that has an opposition, and if you like. And I think that was never intended to be forever. And of course, it took forever to actually get that in place. It wasn't until 2006 when Dr. Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, recently deceased Martin McGuinness, and of course Dr. Paisley is dead now too, actually got together and agreed to sit down together in government, that the Assembly started working. The other aspect of the Belfast Agreement was, of course, Strand 2, and it was relations between the North and between Britain and Ireland, the North and the South. And that required independent chairman, which is why Senator Mitchell, Prime Minister Hookery, and I were called in to chair those. And the third was setting up a Council of the Isles with the premiers of Britain, England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Channel Islands, Ireland, Northern Ireland, to get together on occasion and discuss stuff. But the other issues were dealing, for example, with the police service. The Royal Ulster Constabulary was 90% Protestant and was regarded with deep suspicion by the nationalist or Catholic community. Ian Patton, who had just given up the position of governor of Hong Kong and handed it over to the Chinese, was named to run a group with a Canadian professor aboard from the University of Toronto to come up with a new police service. They did away with the RUC, Royal Ulster Constabulary, came up with the Police Service of Northern Ireland, PSNI. It was going to be the Northern Ireland Police Service, but no cop wants to be called a nip. Changed the uniform and implemented a proactive system of recruiting. At least 25% of recruits had to be Catholic. And over the years, it has raised the percentage. Another issue is, what do you do with prisoners? Prisoners who have been imprisoned for, quote, political crimes. Not what they referred to as ordinary decent criminals, ODCs, who were bank robbers, and, well, of course, a lot of the paramilitaries are bank robbers too. It's how they funded themselves. What do you do with them? They took up a cause, and should they be treated differently? And the answer was, they could be released having served 2 years of a sentence, released under license, having completed 2 years of a sentence. Vastly unpopular with those people who had lost family members due to paramilitary activities on both sides. But without it, there would not have been an agreement. And another issue dealt with the disappeared, those people who disappeared and whose bodies were never found and whose families still wished to be able to recover them and grieve. And the IRA did, in some cases, come up with where they had been put difficult in that part of Ireland because the bogs move and you put a body somewhere and it disappears. So it was an artificial, if you like, but necessary solution. And it hasn't changed. It hasn't developed to the point where there is an official opposition. And I think it hasn't because there is still a deep distrust amongst some of the more, I have to be careful how I say this, some of the older people who are in government. I was in Ireland a couple of years ago on an entirely different issue called Peaceful Schools International, which is run out of St. Mary's University, and I'm on their international board, talking to children who live in conflict issues, talking about anti-bullying and the like. And I was approached at the end of one of our presentations. Presentations are done by the St. Mary's University students. I was approached by a couple of young men who were about 17 or 18, and they said, we want you to know that we have no difficulty, we're all Protestant, but we have no difficulty with Catholics. We don't agree with the antagonistic nature that our political parties on either side are reacting to each other. We just want you to know that. And I said, well, thank you for telling me that. Are you going to go to university? And they said, yeah. I said, you're going to go here, or are you going to go across the water to Scotland or England? And they said, we haven't decided yet. And I said, well, if you do go over there, come back, because you are the people that's going to change that mentality. The people who started voting for the first time this year were born after the Belfast Agreement was signed. And so they, even though the IRA broke the ceasefire in 1996 over their belief that the British government had deep-sixed our suggestions, they have not known the troubles as we knew it. There are still active paramilitary groups, the Real IRA, the Continuity IRA, and they've killed policemen and they've killed the odd soldier, but nothing like it used to be. And the military garrison in Northern Ireland is the same as the garrison in any other town in the United Kingdom. The difficulty now is twofold. One, there was a political nonsense which can happen in any government, I guess, over an issue called the Renewable Heating Initiative, in which to prevent fossil fuels being used, you could use some kind of pelletized stuff, and you were paid to do that, and it wasn't correctly done by the government, the assembly in power. They suddenly found themselves $500 million in debt for paying companies to heat buildings which really had no purpose. Anyway, a ridiculous issue, but it divided the Parliament. Martin McGuinness resigned over it. He also resigned because he was deathly ill and, of course, died a short while later. And Sinn Féin has refused to name somebody in the upcoming election. The Assembly had to be suspended by the Secretary of State, and another election is due next week. That is a danger, and the fact that Martin McGuinness is dead when he was one of the key members, a former senior IRA member in Derry, for influencing the IRA to move towards peace. He's going to be missed in that. The other issue is Brexit. The majority in Northern Ireland, like Scotland, didn't want Brexit. And one of the major benefits of the European Union was that Ireland, the Republic, and the UK were members of the European Union, and the border, once the Belfast Agreement was in place, was open. Prior to that, going through the border was tortuous, with checks under the vehicles for bombs and military and the like. And the free way of trade was tremendous. There's concern now that the border might be hardened because the United Kingdom is not part of the European Union, therefore Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, is not part of and therefore you need a hard border. I think Theresa May is trying to ensure that that doesn't happen, but the mechanics of it are difficult. That's exacerbated by Scotland, who also want to opt out of the Union, and if that happened, would there be a hard border between England and Scotland? You asked a very simple question, I've given you a very complicated answer, but it is not easy, and I watch with some concern how it's going to pan out. I think that was maybe too much information, but okay.
Thank you, John.
Wanted to announce very quickly that the McIntosh Gallery will be open till 4:30 this afternoon if you want to make your way over there. John, thank you for that incredible overview and analysis of Canadian history and global history. After the events of last November, I said to my students, don't be alarmed, don't not be alarmed, just promise me that you'll do one thing, read history. So thank you for reminding us of the necessity of that. Thank you all for your loyalty towards and support of the university and the McIntosh Gallery. Above all, wherever you're going today, go in peace. Thank you very much.